Hello, everybody. Welcome to our PKI roundtable. And let me just start sharing my screen. And we'll be just talking through kind of our war stories, and hopefully it will help you people learn about our mistakes so you don't make the same mistakes. My name is Igal Flegmann. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Keytos. Was in the PKI team at Microsoft, and after a while, I left to co-found Keytos with my brother Marcos, and now we're here talking about PKI. And I'm gonna pass it over to Rich.
Oh, good afternoon. At least it's afternoon where I am on the East Coast here. My name is Rich. I've been doing security since last century, and actually, sadly, PKI since last century as well, with a couple dips, short, brief periods of time where I was not involved in PKI. I've been doing security since then, pretty much touched every part of it. Except there's a disastrous day or two where they let me do antivirus scanning and updates, and that did not work out well. So I moved. They sent me back to PKI, so I'm good there. And I now lead a team of security architects here at Eversource Energy.
Now, Juan.
Yeah, good morning, everyone here from the West Coast. I'm currently the interim product owner for identity and access management here at Columbus Sportswear. Also, senior IAM engineer, and I've been in the industry now, what 24 years, going strong. And through my career, I've put many hats. I've touched probably a lot of solutions, and being in the security space, kind of on and off, but more dedicated in the last six-ish years. So yeah, I'm excited here, and thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you for being here. And last we have Mark. Hey, Mark.
Hey there. I'm a zero trust architect and the identity management engineer at MIT Lincoln Laboratory. I've been doing PKI for, probably 15 years. I started off at the Federal Reserve Bank in Kansas City, and then did a bunch of PKI stuff for them, and then I spent 6 years at UMB Bank here in Kansas City, and now I work for MIT.
Cool. All right. And as they all said, they were a little bit humble, but all of them are super smart, and I've learned a lot from them in our conversations. So I'm excited to have you guys here, and thank you for joining. I guess I'll get us started with one of the stories. And this one is kind of cool because I didn't make the mistake, but I was the one tasked to fixing it. So, and I think that's a lot of how many of us get into PKI. Many of us get thrown into PKI, and all of a sudden you become the PKI person, and next thing you know, you're the PKI expert, and that's kind of how it goes. So this is one of my first war stories from when I joined Microsoft out of college. I was 3 months in, and someone had renewed the same CA with the same key. The problem with that, and it's really cool because Microsoft, when you're kind of renewing the CA, kind of prompts you like, hey, you want to keep the same key? And someone said, yeah, that sounds fine. And the problem with that is that actually cert retrieval, when it's building the chain, you might actually grab the old certificate. So we had to make sure that every single computer at Microsoft did not have the old certificate when that one expired, so it wouldn't build the wrong chain and say that the certificate was expired when it was actually built by the correct chain. So basically what we had to do is write code and everything, because there's no way Microsoft employees can go into every single computer they manage, search for that certificate everywhere, and get it done. So we had to write code. Windows was pretty simple because everything is in the cert store and you kind of go through and find it. And when you're at Microsoft, you have a lot of people that know Windows and know how to do that stuff. But then when I got to the Linux side, the guidance kind of said like, hey, Linux is hard, just look for it. And I went to my manager and I was like, hey, like, I think I have a quick script that can get this done, but I'm kind of new here, so I don't know if like I'm missing something. And he was like, no, that seems to solve it. And it seems it just kind of like went through everybody. And after that, I was one of the Linux Me's at Microsoft for certificates by just kind of being thrown a Sunday to make sure that every certificate was out of the system. So that's mine. I don't know if Rich, you want to go for another war story?
Sure. I'll focus on mistakes. That works. I've done those or learned things through adventure. A long time ago at a former company, where we had a PKI, Windows integrated, built on ADCS, though it wasn't called that at the time. And we were trying to set it up for certificate-based VPN. And this one and we had imported the root CAs on the VPN switch, and we imported the issuing CAs, and none of the client certs would work. We could not make the handshake work. And we went back and we checked, and yes, the import command had worked fine. And on this box was command line interface only, so it was really hard to visually check on these things, but it said okay all along. And it took us about 2 or 3 months worth of fighting with the network guys because I didn't know much about network until I made PKI work, and then I became the network expert for security, And in the long run, we're talking with the manufacturer, and we finally managed to realize that they had built their PKI and implementation with an RSA toolkit, which only supported certificate lengths up to 2048 bytes. Our root CA was 4096. But the command worked fine. There was no error messages at all. And they came back a little bit later and said, oh, we put a fix in it. So go ahead, do the patch and then do it. All right, so we patched it, and then we tried to import the root CA again. It failed, but this time it gave us an error message and said, certificate too long, truncated. So that was the vendor's solution to our 4096 byte key problem. I then went ahead and built a brand new PKI based on 2048 byte CA keys. And amazingly enough, we imported that and it worked fine, and then it would happily recognize client certificates. But I did have to go back and retire an entire PKI connected to our AD and deploy a new one. So the lack of error message was concerning. So it just took months in the manufacturer to get us to help us with that.
So now anything that happened after that is your fault because now you built all the PKI.
Yes, so we changed VPN vendors, went to a different one. I'm now at a different company with a similar one, but now I know what to look for, and it's one of those things I check, and it's like you do consideration, even especially now 20 years later, where we can use much more lengthy keys, particularly on Windows, because Windows has support for it all. But if you look at some of the platforms you're integrating to, that may really limit your ability and your options as you build a CA that you think is the most secure. You really need to look at where integration points are. And because of the function cert chaining, it has to come all the way down from your root. They all have to. Your root can only be so strong because of that cert chain process. And that dev toolkit, I believe, is still active. So for non-Microsoft platforms that may present an issue with your your Cisco iOS devices or your Nortel or your Aruba or whatever, there'll be something to check before you get too far. So make sure you validate your requirements of where you expect to use your PKI, or the places where you don't expect to, but it might at some point 10 years in the future. Look at those things.
And also look at generic errors and try to figure out what they mean, because they never mean what they say they mean.
Yeah, or no error. It's like, if we had enumerated the root certificate, maybe we would have seen it. I'm not even sure they had a command for that, but something I should have looked at that point.
Yeah. All right, cool. Juan, you want to share something with us?
Yeah, I luckily have not had any issues like that, other than blowing a test certificate authority, but that's that's little thing. No, seriously, very early in my career, I think I've been in the sysadmin position just for a few months. Still trying to transition into that, came from desktop to sysadmin. And yeah, I didn't quite wasn't quite familiar with inner mechanics, and ended up blowing up a dev environment. Luckily, it was very little, or a test environment actually. There was not very much into it. Lesson learned is there was a big lesson learned after that. But mostly what I through my career and my experience with PKI is just dealing with the 5 big issues that I think pretty much a lot of us deal with or have dealt with, and those are, anything the certificate problem, which is um, uh, uh, the pitfall of issuing certificate, just the management certificates themselves. Any deployment problems where we reuse the same certificate across devices, security problems, which we kind of share the private keys. How do we stop from doing that? The governance and the visibility problems, and all of those manual and resource intense work that comes from that. Really, that's where my hindrances come from through my experience working in PKI.
Yeah. And that's where a lot of your feedback has been great on automating a lot of that. So I really appreciate that. And last but definitely not least, Mark, I don't know if you want to share with us some of your war stories.
I'll tell you one. It's not my story. It's a story I inherited, and it's one of the few that I can share. So for those of you don't know, Lincoln Laboratory is what's called an FFRDC, or a federally funded research and development center. So we do a lot of work for the Department of Defense and some of the other defense contractors around the country. One, we have a PKI system that was initially built to be a part of the federal bridge, meaning certificates that we issue, because our certificates were complete S/MIME implementation for signing and encryption certificates that are issued to every single user. That email that we sign and encrypt would be able to be decrypted by other DoD contractors and things in the defense. So we went through all of this trouble to get our certificate authority onto the federal bridge. And we hired an outside vendor to help us out with. It took years to get this done. Had to go through all of these security reviews. Our PKI system is super overly complicated. Like, we have to have dual use operator cards to even restart an OCSP server. So you have to have 2 operator cards to do it. So it's painfully over engineered. Finally, the day came. We got our certificate. You're on the federal bridge. Congratulations. And then to come find out, it's like why does nothing work? It's like, oh, now you have to go to every single DoD sponsor that might want your certificate, and they have to choose to import your root certificate into their trust stores to do that. So they went through all of this work for nothing, because the Navy and the Air Force is like, we don't want your certificate. We're not going to include that into our cert store. So our prime contract is actually with the Air Force, and they're like, we don't want your certificate. So basically we did all this work for nothing. And that's probably our biggest horror story there, is that we went through years of work and more money than I care to ever admit to get something done, and then to find out, like, oh, it still doesn't matter because we're not going to trust your roots.
Yeah, that sounds very painful. So now that we have done a little bit of kind of horror stories, I want to leave the people with some advice. So we'll do a quick round of advice. I know, Rich, you wanted to talk a little bit about krills on vacations, which I don't know why PKI people love setting up cert expirations and krill expirations on vacations. But I'll do one that Paul Adair, one of the guys that taught me most of what I know for PKI, taught me was if you're using an HSM, like a full rack, like 1U HSM, make sure to ask the data center people to put it at eye level. You never want to be on the bottom rack, have to be like laying on your stomach for like 3 hours setting up an HSM for a PKI. So that one was something that I've learned, that put it at eye level. And remember, of short people like me. So if you are like 6'5", don't ask to be put at your eye level, put it somewhere in between. So because I also had to be sometimes kind of like standing on my toes to be able to look at IP addresses and everything.
We'll get you a book to stand on.
Thanks. Many books. So now, Rich.
Tips. One, don't implement a PKI without also implementing an SSL certificate management tool. And that can range from text files to spreadsheets to access databases to SQL databases to full-blown products. But I refuse to deploy another PKI without having a management tool for the SSL certs. And I say specifically call those out because they use aliases, which means now you have to tie them back to applications, and then you have to find application owners to reauthorize renewal of the certs and all that. Too painful. So definitely have to do that before you get into the pain, and that allows you to prevent people from putting in wrong, sending their own certificate request in with minimal key lengths, wrong organizational, configurations, in algorithms that you would not accept, all of that kind of stuff. So getting it, that is a key thing to do it yourself. You mentioned the accrual expiration dates. Check them before you go on vacation. There's nothing like having nobody in the company able to write to their C drive to save their documents because the CRL for their EFS cert has expired. At any rate, check it before you go because somebody will find it while you're out. That's invariably when it happens. So multiple CRLs, including your root, because root typically expires every year depending on what you accept for defaults. CA cert expiration is less likely, but it does happen as well. Those are easier to capture and usually have a lot more notice on those. Somebody mentioned it already, but private key wandering, we have a problem with that. And once you give one person a private key who's not a security or not a certificate manager type of person, it's going to wander. So just whatever you can do to build systems that prevent the sysadmin or the IIS admin from having the private keys. Here, I'll put it in the search store for you. You can't export it. The worst you can do is delete it, and we'll just give you a new one. But don't allow them to export it for, they want to have a backup or they want to install it on multiple servers.
Make sure your chips are your friends.
That's right, yeah. So once it goes out, and I will not share a horror story about that. But trying to think what was the other one I wanted to talk about, just mention. I think that probably covers the biggest points. I think the other generic thing is if you're going to design a PKI, spend extra time on your requirements gathering. Keep in mind you're building essentially a 10 to 20 year asset or system. So make sure you think about future technologies, applications that you don't use today. I mean, they're sort of out of the box. There's file encryption, there's disk encryption, there's obviously TLS or SSL. There's things like code signing, and now you're talking about timestamp servers. So whatever you think you're going to use it for, just be aware that you're going to have probably 5 or 10 more use cases that are going to come up, and you're going to want to leverage your PKI. So you have to think about those ahead of time, like the Federal Bridge thing. If you're going to be partnering or sharing with another company, you're going to need to make sure that you have a certificate practices statement, and that's really detailed so that they can decide whether to or not to accept your root cert. Luckily, I haven't had to deal with the feds significantly. But I know in the pharmaceutical business is the DEA. It's a big deal, and the FDA, more importantly, to having cross certification available there. So, gather your requirements carefully. Spend a lot of time. Spend extra time on that because building a CA is probably the easiest part of all that.
Yeah, and the problem is having to rebuild it later because something got missed. And doing everything again.
I will share on that. So my current company, I've been here less than 5 years, no, just over 5 years. I've already had to build 2 PKIs here. Luckily, the second was not to replace the first, but it was because we came across a technology that did not support RSA keys. They have very, very small RAM footprint, so they needed ECC because of shorter key lengths. Did not see that one coming.
Yeah, it's usually the other way around. No one supports ACC.
Yeah, exactly. So.
All right, Juan.
Yeah, my advice is it's one of the things I try to focus here at Columbia is we run a skeleton crew, a very talented group of engineers, but we run lean, and one of the things I like to focus on is mostly on efficiency. How do we do more with less? And the importance of automation, I'm sure all in the industry we can acknowledge that you have to leverage on that, and also that is because and the importance of visibility, know what's in your environment, not only the certificate stores, but also across like what the certificate of devices, etc. And how do you automate something like that? And that's how when I spoke to Eagle a few months ago and showed me the solution, I was pretty excited about it. It's something that I've been thinking about, because we have, I think and we did some statistics in the last couple of months that about 30% of our productivity was going towards renewing certificates, and that may be, it may take 10 minutes or so or whatever it is, but it feels like death by 1,000 cuts. And that's just, it takes focus away. At those 10 minutes, they're exponentially magnified to, X number of minutes just because you lose focus, your task switching and whatnot. So yeah, my recommendation is, hey, know what's in your environment and just start thinking of ways of how do you optimize what you have and what your target goal is to enhance security, to enhance governance, to bring visibility, and provide that value to you and the organization.
Cool. Yeah. And Mark?
Sorry there, I was on mute for a second. I want to talk about user acceptance. So one of the problems that we have at the laboratory is certificate fatigue. People get really, really upset, like, oh my gosh, there's so many certificates. Why do we do it? We're a passwordless organization. We use certificate-based authentication on smart cards and YubiKeys. So we're basically do PIV authentication. Our single sign-on engine is also driven with certificate-based authentication. People get tired of certificates. And they get tired of being presented a list of certificates and not knowing what certificate to pick out of the list. So this is where we get here. If you're going to do authentication certificates, make sure your authentication certificates are only issued from a single issuing CA. That CA should only be used for auth certificates and nothing else. That way, when applications say, hey, I need a list of certificates that are going to be suitable for authentication, you can say, hey, only accept certificates from this CA. That way, any other certificate on your machine, signing, encryption, whatever, doesn't show up in that list. It makes that list a lot cleaner. The other thing, too, around this is revocation. If someone loses a token, or someone leaves the organization, or someone for whatever reason gets a new badge and has to get a new certificate, make sure you revoke the old certificate. Otherwise, in our case, our notification system says like, hey, you have a certificate that's expiring in 2 weeks. I just replaced my certificate 3 months ago. What do you mean I have one expiring in 2 weeks? It still notifies off the old one because there's not really an efficient way to find out what certificates that are valid are still actually in use. No, unless we're going to something, like Keytos or Venafi or Keyfactor or one of those other vendors like that. But and then the last one on that user acceptance is making sure that certificates that are going to be in the user's view have very clear naming convention. Their subject names should be very clear. Should have like, what is the certificate? Is it an auth? It says like auth dash username, instead of like, oh, your user ID and some serial number, because otherwise you have no idea what the certificate's used for. And then you end up with someone, why does this certificate not work? Oh, because the extended key usage is wrong and you picked the wrong certificate and things like that. And it leads to a great deal of frustration. So the certificate labeling is a very important factor when choosing to have certificates that are going to be very visible to the users. Anyways, that's my stories.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, that's something that we have seen across everything is, and you can see kind of like the theme of everybody saying here is do it easier for your user. We are the experts at our organizations, so we have to make it that the user cannot mess up, because for us, certificates is kind of like our life, and that's what we do, that's what we know. But for the user, it's just an obstacle to get their job done. So we have to make it as transparent as we can, make it that they don't have to think about it and they just do the right thing. So usually we would have time for Q&A, but we actually had a really nice conversation and we do not have time for Q&A. So if you have any questions or anything, send them in and we can quickly respond to them. But if not, thank you so much for joining, and thank you, Mark, Juan, and Rich, to join us for this roundtable.